Lorilet just said that I'm in the dark, and that's because I'm in my room and I keep it kind of dark because I like it like that. I'm one of those people that love a dark room. So welcome to Soul's Code. I am Andra Annette in the dark, and this is Lorilet Monegro, bright and shiny. So I am, now that I told everybody, in my room because Lorilet and I just came back from a delicious lunch at San Martino's. And if you've never been there, I suggest you go because I've been going there since I was a child and I absolutely love it. It's the greatest Italian food. It's family run and the prices are even better than the food. So that's that. But I tend to get a little relaxed after a good meal, and we ate quite a lot of food. So I said, I know we got to do that show in a little bit, but I was starting to get into my mellow mood. So
Yeah.
Laura and I were actually talking about what we wanted to talk to you about tonight, right? And that's something we don't usually do. So, we spend time together. We talk about a lot of things, not just the show. And uh, we really think that we wanted to breach the subject of acceptance. And here's why. Because there are a lot of people out there suffering with different things, special needs, parents having a hard time accepting that diagnose or managing those children. But globally, there seems to be a little problem with acceptance of people in general. Some people are more accepting of some people than others, and we just kind of wanted to drop a dime on that. So, so Laura, what do you think about that?
Well, as I was telling you, I think that, this whole idea of acceptance and how much, we've been told all our lives, some form of rejection, right? And it comes hand in hand, the idea of acceptance and the idea of rejection. It's like having a coin, two different sides of it. At the core of it is there's this displeasure with who we are, what we believe, where we stand, and expectations, right? Like, no one sets out, for example, in the case of children with special needs, sets out to have a child with special needs. The expectation is that we're going to have, a perfectly average, functionally viable offspring, right? And sometimes that doesn't happen, and sometimes that may be more visible than not. Sometimes you think you've had a child that is quote unquote within normal limits in their development, and then they come to adulthood and come to find out, no, they had some other kind of underlying issue going on that maybe was undetected. And all of a sudden, that whole idea of normalcy shatters. And, I always come back to the question of like, what does that do to love? The perception of that being. Do I love them less? Is there as a decrease because my expectation wasn't met? And this is at the core of these ideas of enough,ness, of acceptance, of value driven interactions in our relationships. And it's almost like just an invitation for us to reflect, right? On, hey, you know, how do I love what I love and who I love and why? Or how does that grow on a continuum? Or maybe not grow, because guess what? Relationships sometimes, because they become so conditioned or so conditional to the different expectations that are unmet, how does that then shatter that love, right? It
Mm.
goes whether it's a love relationship, a parent-child relationship, whether it's a teacher parent interaction where a parent might think, oh, well, the therapist is going to fix it, fix the issue, or, because there's a lack of understanding and acceptance of what is in front. of us right at the moment. And the expectation now is placed on the other person because it's easier to find a scapegoat than to accept what I have in front of me and how to proceed. So at the core of it, I see it in many different ways. I face it in many different ways. And I have to always get back even to myself. What am I willing to accept? Right? Whether I'm in a relationship, outside of a relationship, or simply just on my own. And when I say relationship, I'm talking about my own parent-child relationship, right? There are things that I don't necessarily like that my daughter might do, but then I have to come to that realization. What am I willing to accept or not accept? What are my expectations? Have they been met, not met? What are her expectations as a daughter? So it's more of an invitation of us just kind of sitting with that a little bit longer. What does that look like? Because we can have operational definitions of what that looks like depending on the different situations based on our core values and beliefs, right?
So I'd like to take this a little step further. Maybe it's a different direction all along. I think that the value of differences is greatly diminished. And because of the world's view on what it is to be different has been ostracized for so long instead of embraced as our authentic selves or our uniqueness, it's become more of a stigma, that if you're different. I said stigmatism one time too on a show, and I was like, I'm talking about eyes, and I was meant to say stigma. So sometimes I watch some of my videos and I laugh at some of the things that come out of my mouth. But I think because you're just talking. So but I think that when people are different, because there's so many different world views going on now. There's that whole race issue, there's culture issues, there's gender issues,
Right.
and everybody's pushing equality in this and equality in that, and I think they're just pushing any envelope they can to take a look off what's really going on, and I don't really think them drawing attention to people's differences is really helping it in the way they believe it is, because I think acceptance comes from seeing that in individuality as something we should embrace and not ostracize, and it becomes a stigma. And I think that a lot of times we place so much value on what's wrong and so much attention on this is wrong in society because people are different and things aren't working out the way they expect. And acceptance comes from lack of expectations. So when you don't expect something, like if you give a gift to someone, you don't expect something in return. You don't give for those reasons. So it does come down to those core values and what you expect from other people or you accept from other people. So like friendships or not conditional based on everything you have in common, but also on those differences that allow you to bring out the better part of other people, right? Because if everybody was the same,
Mm.
it
It
would
would
be a
be
very
horrible.
boring world. It would be a very boring world. There would be no fun. Everybody would just be walking down the street in unison. No, there would be no differences, and you really couldn't express yourself fully. But I think because we are lacking in acceptance in basic things, and we are raised in that way based on somebody else's moral concepts or values or belief systems that are passed down generationally. We
Yes.
bring that into how we rear our children instead of at some point deciding, because when you're a child you have to go with the flow. They're the parent, you're the child, right? There's to a point you really don't have that voice, right? But at a certain age you do get to make those decisions and say, even though my family believes this is okay, those aren't my beliefs, and I choose to raise my child different. Like some parents believe in spare the rod, spoil the child, and other people would never dream of raising their hands to their child. So people are raised very differently,
Mhm.
right? But overall, in my opinion, I think we're lacking basic acceptance for very needed core values, um we just accept that there's people living all over the streets because that's become the new norm, that there's more homeless, right? So should we be so accepting of those things, or should we do something about it? So there are certain times we're too accepting and other times we fail to accept, right?
It makes sense. At the same time, I find that, many of the things that we experience are by design, right? Like, even take something as you mentioned. We've become almost like complacent with the fact that we could see people just be homeless and struggle throughout their lives in the streets as if there was no solution to it. But we also have no problem sending billions of dollars for people to kill themselves, each other, right? And so I think it's a matter of what we have decided is priority. If the system didn't have such issues, which we'll all encounter life issues, then the system would collapse. So guess what? They kind of feed into a cycle of like, oh, this is what it is, and we push people through the system and we have to have them this. It's almost like you have to go through this whole process to maintain that very system. Because you imagine if people started to slow their row and actually tap into their inner knowing, into their understanding, into critical thinking, not fight or flight response, into planning, into grounding their process of being and acceptance of who they are and tapping into their enoughness. Oh, whoa, that would be a hard group of people to tell them what to do.
Yes, I agree. I agree, but I think that we're desperately in need of that more than we ever have been, because we've been so disconnected from what's really right and wrong, that right and wrong really doesn't have any. Years ago you could say if you kill somebody it's wrong, or if you lie it's wrong, but these things have become so common and become a way of life that it's hard to gauge where to start to move people forward, because people are very disconnected. We talk about this all the time.
Yes, we
People
do.
aren't really engaged. They're engaged with their external environment, but not their internal environment. And
Yes.
all of that happening and really showing up, as you use different terminology, but showing up for themselves as with their own intelligence and tapping into that,
Mhm.
there wouldn't be all this need and all this confusion and all this um difficulty with acceptance, because we'd say, okay, this is unacceptable because we deserve better.
Right.
And you know I can accept this because this is kind of normal behavior, right? So we've gotten so used to abnormal
Mhm.
in our day-to-day lives that I find it ironic that acceptance is so hard for people to master, right? Because
Yeah.
we've become very accepting of very abnormal behaviors all around us. We're not tapping into any part of ourselves as humans. We're always on the go. We're always looking for something else. We're never here where we are. We're never present. But yet we always have a judgment about someone else and what we're willing to accept. Whether and when we're talking about that child and that parent's disappointment, right?
Yes.
Is it her perceived disappointment in not having a child that might be what other people accept? Or is that inability to accept because she feels like it somehow makes her less, like she did something wrong? Because I think that ties into it. I think when people have a child that is born maybe with something, not even just special needs, but any kind of disability or disease process like cerebral palsy or any of those things, that a parent kind of steps back and says, why is this happening to me? I did everything right. And how, you know, now I have to learn how to deal with this too, right? So I think that there's that big grieving process that we spoke of
Mhm.
on a previous show, because they are grieving the sense of being able to do certain things with that child, right? That they would have been able to do maybe easier if the child didn't have developmental issues or special needs, right? They might have a different relationship on an emotional level with that child, but it's new territory. So is it lack of acceptance, or is it lack of knowledge in how to deal with them? Because we have to be able to decipher that at some point to get the parent the appropriate help. Is it them not being able to accept that they don't know how to deal with this new child? I mean, bringing home a child, a baby from the hospital, any newborn, the first time someone's a parent, it's all new, you know?
Yeah.
So now you know, they're not just new parents, but they're new parents of a different situation altogether, right? A child, even though they still have the same basic needs, love, belonging, they're going to progress at a different stage. And that every time they hit a new stage or a new progression, it's like a new learning experience for that parent. Does
You know,
anything I'm saying like hit home with you? Do you
oh no,
understand where?
absolutely. You know, there's no one particular process as I have experienced with the different people that I've worked with throughout my lifetime so far. What I have picked up on is the change in this continuum and the difference that might be when is, let's say, the parent knew they were having a child with a particular need, such as like with Down syndrome, or whether they didn't know and everything was fine up to a certain point, and then boom, let's say an autism diagnosis where developmental milestones seem to be like within normal limits all throughout, and then an event happened. Many people anecdotally always mention after the 18-month vaccines, when on or about the onset of these kind of signs start coming out. You know, people want to always dismiss it in terms of the people in the pharmaceutical industry and all of that. But anecdotally, you interview parents and they're going to tell you, well, right about after 18 months, you know, or shortly after, you know, people are going to tell you anecdotally, and it's like, oopsie, it's right there, you know, and so there's not necessarily a causation, but there's some kind of relationship there that seems to be happening anecdotally. And so when parents come in and there's this pain of like a sense of loss, like for example, wait, I had my child, they were talking, they were having words, they were this, and then boom. Now it's really like a shattered, like, no, I won't accept this because I had a child that was fine, and now it's not. It's like a real painful, like full of resentment, anger, sadness. It's like a real stormy place to be. And I've evaluated many children in the course of 23 years, 24 years. And all I can tell you is the sense of also powerlessness. So
Mm,
there's this whole mixture of emotion that I am not going to tell you that goes away. Unfortunately, what happens is that it morphs where there might be the sense of hope and, oh, I see changes and my kid is improving once services start kicking in and certain things begin to take place. And sometimes the child is able to become a very functional in their communication, and some of them overcome many of these limitations that initially show up. But then it may come all the way later when all of a sudden my kid is, a teenager, and this teenager hasn't cognitively matured, and they're still functioning like they're 12 and maybe they're 18 or they're 19, and they keep getting older and the gap now widens. And it's like, wait, what's going on? My kid is like functioning like he was in sixth grade, but now he's 21. And so that can become a very difficult, where again, it resets that sense of powerlessness, that sense of like, where's my kid, my child that was making progress? But it's not that. It's that the gap keeps widening because now you're only growing chronologically in age. And so no one sits down to have these conversations about, wait, this will morph and the needs are going to again kick in, where now you have to plan a future set of interventions and ways that you will support this person who will now continue to age. So having appropriate planning, having clear diagnosis matters tremendously to being able to put in place the support systems as they change, because those support systems will change based on the demand of those needs, right? If the increased needs happen as the child becomes an adult and now it's not growing cognitively, not growing in other areas of independence and function, then you need to provide the supports. And those are hard conversations. There's nothing pleasant about that.
What about for those people though that don't take their children to regular checkups because they don't have the great insurance? So what happens to them because they are going to get those conversations much later. Some
Sometimes
people,
they don't get the conversation.
yeah, and sometimes, and I hear about a lot of parents that know their child needs those needs, but those services aren't available or they're denied. So that's a whole other conversation. But what about children that say that are not developmentally different cognitively, but physically? Children that have physical developmental delays, or like maybe they don't hear, right?
Mm.
Or um, there's problems with speech. So, I mean, there's other different types of delay, like for a parent to think that a child might not ever hear them say, I love you, or their name, or their voice. That's got to incite some types of feelings too. So we kind of know that the support systems are more geared towards the children in the side of the system, the ones that get that help. So what would be some recommendations for these parents? Because the parents often don't get the support they need. And I see that a lot. I'm in the community working every weekend, and I can't tell you how many things I see that slip through the cracks. And I'm like, oh my God. And, you do what you can from that point. Okay, I know this child should be having, physical therapy, OT, PT. How come they're not getting that school service or whatever they need to get? Will this help them, right? Um, so you can implement them from when you find it, but there's going to be a much broader delay because those services weren't started at those instrumental time when children are basically sponges and can absorb and learn more. So the later these go on, these delays or these, incapabilities in the children to really process certain information, the harder it becomes to teach these children later on.
100%. And this is why the issue with early intervention, when you think about, establishing the neuronal pathway to learning, right? One of the things that needs to happen is that strengthening of the learning. And, the longer a parent waits to interact, to decide, to go for services, or to, I'm going to say, switch their thinking into becoming more of an advocate for their child, realizing that when that child is a minor, that child is not going to be self advocating for what they need, especially when they have multiple issues that might be happening. They may lack the awareness and just the confidence to voice things that they feel they would want or need. And I think that, it's a very difficult position for a parent to be in when the system does not automatically chooses to provide support services that are in tandem, not only with the child receiving whatever they're needing, but also the parent receiving not only a very thorough, hey, let's have a conversation with you, conversation, not only about the child, but let's talk about you. What are your needs in your household? What do you think will help you support your child best? What kind of training you believe would allow you to carry over information and develop skills that then carry into life skills, not only for your child to have, that's all fine, but for you as a parent now dealing with a new situation to also have those skills. And I think that, the system and the approach to how education is delivered requires a review. But again, I am in no position to be able to, one, demand it or implement it because I don't have those kinds of, you know, situation. That's not where I'm positioned. My positionality in the field does not really allow me to influence it that way. Now, in this conversation, if somebody happens to watch what we're talking about and says, you know what, I really want to talk to that lady. I'd like to explore what she means by that and what is it that she's thinking. And they're in that position, right, to either implement legislation, because all of these things can be shaped in society where we
That's
have an awakening and we now realize, you know what, there are better ways that we can approach all of this. We may need to be asking better questions that lead to better conversations and then a rethinking of processes. All of these have to do with the process. They have nothing to do with changing diagnosis, have nothing to do with spending more money. Sometimes when you intervene in this way that is more holistic, your outcomes exceed and you're able to meet benchmarks that otherwise would not have been met. You're able to then create a society that not only becomes more globally aware and encompassing, because now you have a parent that can serve as an advocate, can then be in that role of support. Um, so this acceptance piece even impacts that the parent's ability to be able to then switch their role to an advocate and have the agency to act on behalf of their child, take the actions necessary to go to the appointments, figure out what kinds of supports, read through a whole bunch of evaluations and understand and ask questions when they don't understand and pick someone who could be almost like a liaison in that process. Yes, there are advocacy agencies, but the truth is parents are navigating something new as much as the children. And that whole newness needs to be supported and
I
parents need to be prepared.
I agree. I don't think that the interventions are early enough. So prevention is a good predictor of how we do. So I mean they do have screenings that pregnant women can go through to see the chances after a certain age if she's at risk for a child that might have Down syndrome or developmental issues, right? But I think that regardless of the age, that should be available. So that if, and not because they can say, okay, well, I'm not going to have it, or I'm going to put it up for adoption, or I'm going to do this, or, not for those purposes, but really what anybody does with their child or how they raise it, that's up to them, right? So I'm not having that conversation. Um, Pro no con, I don't discuss it. But
Right. I personally.
it's not my place. I can't decide what's right for someone else's life. It's not my place. But I'm saying that if those situations were available earlier, that people got tests, like they have to find out if they need certain multivitamins, if they're at risk for diabetes, if you
Right.
know, induced, during pregnancy or thyroidism or any of those things, right? That are usually induced during pregnancy or other risk factors, placenta previa or abrupta, whatever they're at risk for, right? Because of the hypertensive issues or whatever. I think that they should focus on giving those early intervention tests so that in the likelihood that that happens, they would have known in their third trimester and they would have been able to prepare for that and maybe get some of that information prior to the birth of that child. Because now there's some acceptance going on. They know this is what we're dealing with. This is what, some of the challenges we're going to have to face. They might be able to make some changes in the work environment, maybe because there is going to be a greater support system needed, right?
Absolutely.
So maybe the parent gets a day job that's in close proximity to where the child is getting that early intervention or whatever is going to make it easier for them to assimilate into the situation. So I think that that type of prevention really should be in place because you know I think there's this in anticipatory guidance that we have throughout life. Like we're taught to expect things at certain milestones in our life, right? You go through menopause at this age, you get married at this age. So we have all these things, right? But there's also a certain time for anticipatory grieving. Like we expect, like in the medical field, if someone is losing a part of their body or they're having an ostomy where they're now defecating through a stoma or something different like that, we expect them to grieve a loss of that because it's different, right? So
It's
and it changes, it makes a change in who they feel like they are as a person. Even if it's this much of your finger, it's your finger that was there and now it's gone. So there is that anticipatory grieving, and we have to know that as nurses, can they look at that stoma? Because we want to get them to look at that prior to discharge to be able to make sure they're going to be able to care for themselves. Because if they can't look at it, how are they going to trust change the dressing? How are they going to care for that if they're not okay with that? So we have to be able to assess those, right? So I think you know also even in mother well units where mother daughter mother baby units, not mother daughter, mother baby units, they see if the mom is nurturing the child, wants to hold the child, things like that. So they look for those key milestones of bonding, you know
Mhm.
just like they do even when the child's breastfeeding. Does the child latch on? So there are all these situations that would be indicators whether or not they're grieving the loss of their child, so that someone could intervene, a social worker, someone. We understand that even though you've known this for a couple of months, this is difficult for you, that they can get that support, maybe involve them in some other situations with families that are going through similar things, and what they've done, and let them see some of the possibilities that the child can have a normal life, you know,
Hmm.
that with the right interventions and with the right acceptance and support, this child can really thrive, right? Instead of putting them in a box where their special needs, they might not ever have a normal life. Because the parent is as a parent, you think about those milestones that you might have with your child, their first kiss, their first, their first
Right,
boyfriend, their first kiss, that high school dance, that
right,
wedding that you might go to, all these things that you're anticipating
right.
having with that child that will change
Or they may or may not
or
be.
not occur at those
Right.
times.
Yes. That
So
that's
it's a lot to take. So um offhand, are there some recommendations you can make for parents that are going through this? Like what kind of services they can get in touch with in their community, in their local community, to find out about services that are offered for children with special needs?
Yeah, well, in the early ages, the early intervention agencies go through the Department of Health. Aside from that, their pediatrician is a number one resource, not only to refer out to, psychological support services, counseling services, and also for mental health support. Unfortunately, still in 2024, almost 2025, we have individuals who think that if they ask for these types of support, that means they're crazy or that they're weak or that they're not fit or all kinds of things that people associate with getting support services, when in fact that becomes like a key to being able to get access to the learning that they need, to the medication if they need it, to other home health aid care that they might need because maybe they're overwhelmed and they need someone to go to their home and
Give
help
them
them for two
respite
or
care.
three
Yeah.
hours. Not because you're here chilling, but because you're so probably emotionally worn out. You may not be literally fit to take care of other things that could be taken care of by someone else and to help you focus and redirect your energy in a way that is more sound and healthier for you and your child. The other thing is being able to speak up with your child's teacher if the child is already in a school system. You know, be open about, hey, I'm struggling. I'm struggling with this, that, or the other. And you'll be surprised as a parent the many things that you can get connected to if you don't know yourself how to do that research. But I think that my personal recommendation is for parents to also peel back that layer of, I'm going to say the word pride, because sometimes what happens is pride masks other things where people are not willing to be vulnerable. That idea of being vulnerable, and instead of being vulnerable, people put up a pride face, right? A pride shield. And when you're vulnerable, it requires you to lower your gates and to say, hey, I'm struggling. And to come to terms with the word I'm struggling. Sometimes we struggle with different kinds of issues. And when it's a child that's dear to us, whether that realization of the struggle comes early or whether that happens as your child grows, because there might be something that just comes and attacks your child's developmental path and you're realizing, oh my goodness, my child is regressing, or my child has a specific disorder that was unbeknownst to us. It is so critical to take a moment and remove pride from the equation to the extent possible and say, I'm struggling, I need help. What and where could I go first? And their pediatrician, their physician, medical provider is the most immediate one that they can begin this conversation with.
It's good. That's good. That's a place for them to start. I think we've covered a lot. I really am in the dark here, huh? I just looked over and said, "Wow, I'm in the dark." Um, I think we've covered a lot of information for them, and I think we've talked about acceptance in different lights because the world is not that accepting of people that are different. So I'd like to end it on this note. But for the grace of God, go I. You never know what a person's life is like until you walk a day in their shoes. So if you can be anything, be kind and be grateful for everything that you have in your life today and going forward. So I'm Andra Annette, and this is Lorilet Monegro, and we come in and just talk about whatever we think you need to hear that day. So we've offered you some value in this conversation, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Lorilet or myself. Have a good night.
Good night. Ciao, everyone.